Welcome to In Focus on this Sunday. I'm Josh Robin. Thanks so much for tuning in. Today we're turning our attention to a crime that's seen an uptick in cities like St. Louis. We're talking about the theft of copper wire. Now, the issue is not just financial, but could actually impact public safety. We're talking about vital services, including calls to 911. And joining us on this Sunday is Tony Mattivi, Director of the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. He'll tell us just what would happen if you get caught with copper wire. Plus, we'll speak with Electrify America's Emily Durham on the recent summit she was a panelist on to address solutions to critical communications infrastructure threats. And later, Ellisville Chief of Police Steve Lewis joins us to discuss the impact of copper wire theft on a community level and what it does to local residents. All that and so much more happening right now here on In Focus. Let's begin today's conversation with Tony Mattivi, Director of the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. My Spectrum News colleague, anchor Lori Chung, spoke with him about how copper wire theft is a growing issue in his state. Take a look.
Tony, thanks so much for being here. I want to start with, we're discussing copper wire theft and why it's a growing issue in Kansas and in other areas like the state of Missouri. What exactly is it about copper wire that's making it so attractive to thieves and vandals?
Well, first of all, there's sort of two issues here. One is the theft of the copper wire and the crime issue that results, right? We're seeing an increase in theft of copper wire. That's a crime. It's something that we have to address. The other part of that, though, is what those copper thefts do to the critical infrastructure, including our ability in law enforcement to communicate. And the ability of your hospital to get your medical records and the ability in the private sector to have communication among businesses. So there's really two aspects of it that I hope we can talk about today. But what's driving it, Lori, really is the increase in copper prices. Copper prices are up dramatically, and as a result, they're a more attractive target for criminals.
You mentioned how critical copper wire is to so many businesses. It seems like the kind of problem that can be especially hard on small businesses. Can you talk about how they're impacted by this?
Sure. Any business is increasingly reliant on the cell network and on fiber communications. And copper is critically involved in the ability to communicate by internet. And so any business, when it loses its internet, it loses the ability to market itself, it loses the ability to bill, it loses the ability to communicate with consumers. Copper isn't involved as much in wireless communications or in fiber optics, but the criminals don't know that. And so sometimes they target a fiber optic line thinking that there's copper inside the line, when there's really not. And the result is the fiber optic communication gets impeded or interrupted just like a copper line would.
And you talked a little bit about the other aspect of this is how dangerous this can be for law enforcement, for some of the other industries that rely on this. I'm thinking about airports specifically. Can you talk
Sure.
about some of the dangers inherent to this?
Yeah, I'll talk about law enforcement specifically. We rely on the ability to communicate with each other. And, the best example is when an officer pulls a subject over at roadside in the middle of the night, the officer needs to know whether that person is wanted, whether there's an arrest warrant out for that person, whether the vehicle has been reported stolen. Those kind of communications are absolutely critical. And we rely on our communications infrastructure to maintain that communication system. And so when that infrastructure is interrupted, when it's attacked by somebody trying to make money from the copper that they would steal, they're impairing our ability to keep our officers safe at roadside. When you get taken to the emergency department, the ER is going to need your hospital records to make sure that you're being treated appropriately. Without the ability to communicate over the internet, that hospital may not have that ability. Think about a communications center in any city, the ability to dispatch police cars, fire trucks, ambulances. All of those depend on our infrastructure communication. And when that goes down, that seriously jeopardizes people's lives.
So where exactly are thieves finding these copper wires? Are they just out in the open? Are they exposed? Are they protected?
So some of them might be aerial or overhead, but oftentimes they're protected. They're in boxes, they're in lines underground, they're on telephone poles. The more accessible it is, the more attractive a target it is. As with anything, the easier it is for the thieves to get to it, the better target it's going to be to them. But we're finding them trying to get a hold of lines that are very well protected, even underground and inside sheaths.
So after they steal it, they go through all this trouble, say they're digging underground. What do they do after they steal it, and how much can they make? It sounds like it must be lucrative if they're going through that kind of trouble.
Well, it is lucrative, and the more the price of copper rises, the more lucrative it becomes, and that's why we're seeing the increasing number of attacks against it and the increasing number of attempts to obtain it. How they get it really depends on what happens next. Oftentimes, the copper's contained in a sheath, and we've seen fairly sophisticated operations where criminals will cut the copper line into manageable sections. But then even if it's covered in a sheath, they will set up an operation where they can burn the coating off of, or burn the sheath off of the copper, and then they take the copper to a scrap dealer or a metal dealer and sell it there. And so that's a focus point for us as well. We want to work on educating the folks that are buying the copper and making sure that they're doing it in a reliable and reputable way. We want them to know who their customer is. If they won't buy stolen copper, if the criminal can't sell it, then they're not going to make any money on it. And that will help us target this problem.
Yeah, if you cut down the market for it, where can they go? We're almost out of time here. I just want to ask you really quickly, what is your message to folks? Is there a way for people to help law enforcement crack down on this?
So as with anything in law enforcement, we ask the public to be observant and be communicative, right? You've heard the tagline, if you see something, say something. That's always true. If you see somebody digging in a place that's suspicious, if you see them accessing a communications box and they're not with your communications provider, I hope you'll call law enforcement. But the message that I want to get out there to these folks is they're not just committing a crime. They're not just, trying to take somebody else's property to make money off it. They are really placing people in danger because they have no idea who's communicating over that line that they're cutting. If it is a law enforcement communication center, if it goes to an emergency department, there's no telling who they're placing in danger, but they are placing other people in significant danger by doing this.
And we all rely on these systems. Tony Mattivi, Director of the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lori. Pleasure to visit with you.
Coming up, we speak with Electrify America on what they're doing to combat theft. But first, a word from some attendees at a St. Louis summit addressing how to protect critical communications infrastructure.
Some customers, when they're impacted by these type of events, just see it as an internet going offline or TV going offline. And in reality, a lot of infrastructure like 911 services, healthcare services, banking, hospitals, all these different important locations also feel the effects of these types of events and hurt workflow, surgeries, anything and everything that are going on in the daytime outside of just being online.
Someone may look at it as just theft, right? But when you think of communications are interrupted and you need 911, or hospital communications go down, or communications to firefighters or whatnot are not available, that is an immediate threat to the community.
Thanks so much for staying with us here on In Focus. Our Lori Chung spoke with Emily Durham, the Vice President of Legal and Government Affairs at Electrify America.
Thanks so much for being with us. We're talking about copper wire theft this Sunday. You were recently on a panel at the Summit on Protecting Critical Communications Infrastructure. Can you talk about that panel and what you talked about there?
Yeah, that's right. This past month, there was a really great summit hosted by the communications industry talking about vandalism and, in particular, the effects, on a nationwide level when criminals steal copper wire. And so for us, it was an interesting opportunity to participate, and we were grateful to be invited. Electrify America is North America's largest open DC fast charging network for electric vehicle charging. And so, while we are not part of the communications industry, our pain is quite similar to what the communications industry is feeling when vandals do participate in copper theft. And so what I think one of the biggest things that we saw and that we learned is that a lot of the vandalism, regardless of the industry, looks quite the same. And so this was a great opportunity to bring together various industries to have a much broader dialogue about how do we, really take a bite out of crime, to use an often loved phrase here, but really to how do we make an impact and stem, this crime wave that is impacting multiple different industries and really impacting the consumer.
There is that threat. You say it's a rising problem. And as you mentioned, a major goal of that summit was to raise awareness about this theft and vandalism that is impacting critical communications infrastructure. That discussion, of course, was to come up with some solutions, like you mentioned, to deal with that threat. Were there any solutions that emerged that stuck out to you during that discussions?
There were, and in fact, I think the opportunity to join voices, if you will, across different industries is going to have a significant impact. One of the biggest lessons learned by bringing these stakeholders together was, the inclusion of law enforcement in this conversation. And I think one of the biggest keys to success is ensuring that law enforcement understands not only what this crime looks like, but what the impact is, and really the outsized impact that something like this has on consumers in the country.
You mentioned it's not just copper wire theft. There are other threats to critical infrastructure. What are some of the threats that you're worried about that's keeping you up at night?
Yeah, vandalism in general, right? Copper theft is part of it, but I think vandalism in general, it really does disrupt, people's everyday lives, and that's the essence of why this is so important, right? For the EV drivers, it's not just, your normal passenger drivers necessarily. It also includes medium and heavy duty transport. It also includes public transportation, buses, and so much more. So when you have any sort of vandalism like this, and other the nature of other crimes against infrastructure, it disrupts people's daily lives, and that really is the essence of why this is such an important topic to tackle.
Can you talk about why it's important to safeguard the nation's communications assets? We know it's critically important for all of us. If you could distill that argument down.
Sure. Well, I can't speak for a different industry necessarily, but much like EV driving, EV charging, and the transportation industry, the communications industry is something that people rely on, right? EV drivers, people using, the cell phone towers in this country, people using, even home security systems. All of these are linked and tied to people's expectations that when they need something to work, it's just going to be there and it's just going to work. So when you have crime against the infrastructure, it really it compromises an individual's sense of security, sense of, you know, expectations that they have, that things will just be there and work as expected.
EV meaning the electric vehicles, of course, that being, your bread and butter. Electrify America's mission is to build a future with electric vehicles with zero emissions. When you think about this problem of rising copper wire theft and the threat it presents to all of us, especially our critical infrastructure, how does this fit in with all of that, coming up with these vehicles with zero emissions?
Yeah. Electrify America has, like I said, one of North America's largest fast charging networks. We've got more than 1,000 charging stations, more than 4,800 individual chargers. And so once, when you are a large operator, like a lot of the communications industry is, you really do need to think about, how do you protect a network at scale? And that really is part of the important conversation here is when you have a really big footprint, it becomes a very big conversation. And so for the electric vehicle drivers, you're right, there are millions of vehicles in the market today and many more coming, which is exciting. And the infrastructure needs to be there across the country, coast to coast, much like the communications industry. And so having a plan to not only grow, but also protect that infrastructure is part of the key to success for growing electric vehicle adoption, for example.
So critically important. Emily Durham, Vice President of Legal and Government Affairs at Electrify America. Thank you so much for your time and your expertise.
These thefts in themselves are important and critical because if you have a medical device that is using our service or internet, and if those services are disrupted, your device is no longer functioning. And so if you have a family member that's in a crisis or need of aid and has that device in service, it's no longer functioning.
If we lost our ability to communicate, whether it's over the internet, whether it's over the radios, so much of our ability to communicate relies on the infrastructure. And if we lose that, we have lost our ability to function as an agency. So it's not necessarily the fact that folks are stealing copper or committing vandalism, it's the fact that they're attacking the critical infrastructure that we rely on every day to function.
And welcome back to In Focus. Steve Lewis, the Ellisville Chief of Police, joins us now. Chief, so good to see you. I wanted to ask you just a few questions. Can you tell us more to start about on the local level, how copper wire theft impacts small businesses?
Well, one of the things that we see in our community and communities across our region are the small businesses being impacted by denial of service, so to speak. So we see a number of businesses, as soon as they lose the copper that provides them with the necessary services to conduct their business, they oftentimes are impacted much greater than larger businesses because of the economic hardship as well as the inability to provide services to their communities.
So for those who are caught with the theft, what kind of punishment or penalty could typically be expected, if any?
So we typically would consider that to be a felony crime in the state of Missouri. So the penalty could include not just a fine, but a prison sentence. It really depends on the value of the copper being stolen and the methodology that they use. Are they repeat offenders, things of that nature? You could consider some of these people are repeat offenders. They could get multiple years in prison and fines upwards of tens of thousands of dollars.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that. So they come out of prison, you tell me if I'm right, and then they come back and do the same thing. Do you see that?
We do. We see that quite often. We know that this is, there are a couple different organizations or groups that we know that are involved in this type of theft, and they tend to be repeat offenders. They tend to know that they think they know that they're trying to do easy pickings, when in reality we know that the damage that they're doing is definitely very impactful in our communities.
Do they often have problems with drug addiction?
Yeah. So what we see, we typically will see a couple different types of offenders. And I do think that the theft of copper, especially in our region, is directly tied to drug abuse, and those people who are basically looking for what they consider to be an easy theft opportunity to turn those metals quickly for cash and then purchase illegal drugs.
Approximately how many people are we talking about charged with theft so far this year, if you know the number?
So for our region, I reached out to our regional group, and we've probably had a half dozen people charged this year so far. That obviously doesn't really reflect the number of incidences we've had. We have noticed a slight downturn in our St. Louis region. So we haven't had the, I believe, organized groups, but we do still have a lot of the theft that occurs on job sites and obviously with corporations such as yours.
Yeah, so it sounds like some of this is relatively small, but recently a fluorescent man was arrested for copper wire theft at an Ameren substation, and the damages were about $80,000. That's obviously a very hefty amount. Why do people think that doing this is a good idea? What do they get out of it?
Well, I think, as you mentioned, $80,000 was the retail value, I believe, of the theft that occurred. But I think that they see it as a quasi-victimless crime, so to speak. I think that they see it as an opportunity to take advantage, in this case, of a large corporation without realizing the impact that it has on not just the corporation, but the community at large, the people that are in need of those services, be it electric, be it telecommunications, any of those things, I think that, obviously, like most criminals, they're not thinking through the results. They're thinking through the immediate gratification of obtaining this, flipping it at a local metals dealer and getting cash on hand.
Do any of the metal dealers, Chief, have a problem with taking wire that they might suspect has been stolen?
So what we've done is, and it wasn't just because of the copper thefts, but it also had to do with catalytic converter thefts. We have enacted a lot of organizations and cooperations with these metal purchasers where we try and ask them to hold them, to identify or notify us of any suspicious activity. The problem is that this happens with such frequency in terms of people trading in these base metals when they tear down a house, or, there is some significant value associated with these metals. And so it's really about us doing community policing and working with our businesses that are in our communities that do these kinds of purchases to have them alert us if they see something suspicious or the person is clearly not a construction person bringing in, extra metals, things of that nature.
Right, working in metal recycling. We only have about 20 seconds left, but what can companies do to deter this, Chief?
Number one, and first and foremost, is work with your local law enforcement. We don't have an existing task force at this time, but I would encourage companies, reach out to law enforcement, let them know this is on your mind, this is a concern for you, and help us help you put an end to these kinds of things.
Okay, Steve Lewis, the Ellisville Chief of Police. We so appreciate your time, Chief.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.